Some lieutenant colonel stood up and called me a heretic. And he said, like, what you're doing is illegal. We should not do this at all. Like, we will get in trouble. And he stormed out of the room, didn't even offer a conversation. And
Greetings, everybody. Hi, Chris Hamm here. This is the Optimized podcast, sponsored by VisibleThread. And today we have the opportunity to sit down with David Rothzeid, one of the more interesting people in GovCon and somebody that I've crossed paths with about a decade ago. So, David, welcome to the podcast.
it's great to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
All right. So, I know when we met, but let's go a little bit earlier. I like to ask everybody just where'd you get your start? And not a lot of people go to college for acquisition. They don't think about majoring in it. So what's your entry point into this world?
Yeah, I definitely didn't know I was going to be an acquisition officer and spend my life around the defense procurement system. My dad was a businessman though, so at least there's some sort of a thread around being on the business side of things. But joined ROTC actually fairly late in the process, maybe second semester, sophomore year. And so I didn't really understand much of anything about the military. At that point in my life, I could not have told you the difference between enlisted and officer, despite having watched Band of Brothers many times between when it came out and that time in my life. But when I went to field training, the captain, the field training officer in charge of my flight, she was a contracting officer. And despite my best attempts to almost get kicked out of field training because I was just not good, I really learned a lot from her about the career field inside of acquisition community, especially when she talked about the types of deals she was working on from a weapon system standpoint. But the other interesting part about field training, especially for someone who had no immersion in the military space, is you get to hear from every career field. And it was probably, when I joined, I thought I have good eyesight, I'm athletic, I'm smart enough, I should be a fighter pilot, right? That's what everybody does when they join the Air Force. But then you kind of learn about the wide variety of different jobs and roles, and you get to hear about people's day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month. And it was around that time that the acquisition community probably spoke to me more than others. And again, I was an econ major in college, so it just made sense. And so when I came time for my dream sheet, I put acquisition and contracting at the top of my list. I was fortunate enough to get acquisition, although I don't think that many people choose it coming out of college, right? I think more people want to do something more operational. And we can talk about whether or not maybe we should do that first. But that was kind of the career path that chose me. And I had a bunch of different assignments, all of which eventually led me to Defense Innovation Unit, which is where we met while you were the head of FedSim. And I think that was 2016, 2017, right in that time frame. And now lucky enough to be at Shield Capital as a venture capitalist, building off a lot of the work that we had done at Defense Innovation Unit, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later in the episode.
All right, so let's talk about the time at DIUX, or then DIU. So when the announcement came out that DoD was going to go to Silicon Valley, was going to actually convince that world that suddenly it was going to be interesting. Did you you're not in yet? This isn't your assignment yet. Did you hear about it? Did you know, or were you excited about it? Or do you think oh, this isn't going to work?
Well, this might be actually some TMI, but I learned about DIUX through a podcast, the A16Z podcast, in fact, that I've been listening to. It was sent to me by my ex-girlfriend, said, hey, she was living in San Francisco and I was out at Hanscom Air Force Base in Boston, Massachusetts. And she's like, this is weird, the military coming to Silicon Valley where there was no presence. What do you think of this? And I listened to the podcast, and I'd been following Secretary Carter for a while because he had been the head acquisition guy before being DepSecDef and then Secretary of Defense. So he was somebody kind of like that we revered and I knew about despite being, a pretty junior officer at the time. And I didn't really think too much of it. But then a couple months later, a buddy of mine who had been part of the landing party approached me and said, "Hey, you really ought to get interested in Defense Innovation Unit. Like what they're trying to do lines up really nicely with the way you tend to think about acquisition." At that time, I had varying experiences in classified programs and obsolescence programs like post-milestone C sustainment type stuff. And then I'd also been out to Special Operations Command and started to learn like their brand of acquisition. Uh, well, my buddy Adam Gubick told me about all this, and I summarily ignored him. I was an executive officer at that time. I was busy writing reports and doing decorations and setting up quarterly engagements for our unit. And then I guess you could fast forward a couple months later, and Adam again came to me and said, they could really use someone who actually knows acquisition at this organization. At the time, only Lauren Daly was there as somebody with an acquisition background, and they could use some support. So I went out there for a 3-week TDY in January of 2016, fell in love with the mission, came back to Hanscom, convinced my 2-star general to send me on a billet with my name on it to Defense Innovation Unit because they didn't have any active duty billets at the time. It was just reservists, civil servants, and contractors. And the active duty military that got sent there weren't necessarily asking for it. They were just sort of like told and mandated to go without a whole lot of understanding. And so I was just like, how can I get to this place after having an incredible 3-week TDY experience? And was fortunate enough to get my follow-on assignment starting in early summer of 2016, just as DIUX started their 2.0 variation, which is when Raj Shah took over the organization and we started to do things a little bit differently.
So at that time, I remember in my job, there was suddenly interest in non-traditional procedures. Like there were, everything I had done before that was an RFP, an RFQ, like ordinary Part 8, Part 16, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly, like the National Defense Authorization Act started talking about commercial solutions openings. And then there's about this thing I didn't have authority to do called an other transaction, and whether or not you could take an other transaction and turn it into production. And so suddenly there's all of this talk about new authorities and new pathways. Was that happening independent of your, the DIU, or was that just where the forces combined and you guys were like, oh, this is a window for us to do something?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with other transaction authority. So it started in 1958 with the Space Agreement Act, right? And so that authority was provided to NASA because there was an understanding even then that the acquisition system that we were under was not enabling enough flexibility to compete with the Russians, right? Because why was NASA stood up? Really in the wake of Sputnik, right? The Russians had beat us to getting something into outer space. And was our acquisition system the culprit? I don't know. But somehow Congress gave NASA this thing called other transaction. It wouldn't be until the late 90s when DARPA received other transaction authority. And then it would be promulgated into the rest of the DoD in the mid-90s, but it was completely underutilized. It was really only for basic research. Eventually, came like the prototyping OT authority. But what happened is in the 2016 NDAA, so October of 2015, 2371, now it's been updated, so it's no longer that statute, but it was codified, so it was no longer, potentially going to be sunset. So the prototyping OT authority was codified in statute, and they added this thing called subsection F, so 2371BF, and that was allowing of follow-on production contracts, whereby if it was successfully competed, and there was utility value derived from the prototype project, you could move straight into production without having to go through additional competitive procedures. And Lauren Daly, who was leading the acquisition team at Defense Innovation Unit, she sort of clobbed onto that authority, being like, wow, that's something we could really use. And the reason why we liked other transaction authority is because of its inherent flexibility, its collaborative nature, and we could sort of devise a business process that would meet our organization's ethos. So now what's the mission of Defense Innovation Unit? It was to sort of bring in these technology companies who otherwise wouldn't be doing work with the Department of Defense. And we call those non-traditionals, right? They're non-traditionals because they don't have an accounting system that would be DCAA compliant. Therefore, they cannot compete nor participate on cost reimbursement contracts, right? Which is this whole little cottage industry inside the department that you know very well. And so when you add in the codification of the prototype statute with its enablement to go to production and a need to do business differently in order to convince these companies who are highly skeptical of doing work with the Department of Defense, that is what then created the commercial solutions opening, right? So the team at Defense Innovation Unit, led by Lauren, and we had some partnerships with people at Army Contracting Command New Jersey, we created the CSO to then allow us to do business in a way that would help us unlock this untapped potential. That CSO process, right, which is all it is, would then get codified as a DFAR derivative later on by the department. And now what we're seeing is a proliferation of this thing called the CSO in software acquisition, and then in other, directives coming from on high, sort of saying this is a great way to do work, again, with these companies that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be doing work with the department. But really what it should be known for is just like its inherent flexibility and collaborative nature that would then allow for speed in the contracting process.
So this was 8 or 9 years ago. There's at that time, being really early and being in the innovation space, one of the things that I used to say to my staff was, being right but being early is the same as being wrong.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you start going big, as soon as you start disrupting the natural order of things in acquisition, somebody's turf is going to be impacted. Suddenly, are these things protestable? We're going to find out. And then, all of a sudden work starts flowing in a certain direction. So like there was the excitement, then there was a little bit of a correction. There was like, an institutional pushback. But now in 2025, there is a new memo that just came out from the Secretary of War that has basically everything that you just said as encouragement going forward for the defense acquisition system. So I know you've been obviously tracking this very actively. So what do you think of the new guidance?
Wow. So I'll get to the guidance, but I do want to just give like 2 quick anecdotes on, yes, trying to come up with something new and it being met in a way that made me feel less than good about like what we were doing. So pretty early on, after we established the CSO and we had made several awards using that process, I went out to SOCOM, right? And I had just come from that community not too long ago. And I was like briefing them on what we were doing with other transaction authority. And some lieutenant colonel stood up and called me a heretic. And he said, like, what you're doing is illegal. He turned to the audience, said, we should like not do this at all. Like, we will get in trouble. And he like stormed out of the room, like didn't even offer a conversation. And that was just like, that was kind of crazy to me at the time. The other anecdote, and I think you're right that there would become like, that we would hit some bumps along the way, is our 3rd production award to a company called Raincloud was protested. And it was protested by Oracle because they could see what was happening. But we awarded this $950 million production OT to Raincloud based on a very successful prototype project whereby they had helped move a lot of Transcom's infrastructure from like these on-prem bespoke applications and moved it into like a digital cloud-based infrastructure that was like much easier to modify, much easier to keep up, providing great like SLAs to the user base across a myriad of different applications. I mean, some of these were like in Fortran, I don't know. Like it was wild what they were doing and doing it extremely well. And what really made me upset about that protest is Oracle um, didn't even engage on the prototype competition. We had 30 plus companies compete on that prototype. Raincloud won, and they did exceptionally well. And the reason why the GAO sustained the protest is for the simple reason that within the individual solicitation for that prototype project, we did not articulate that the winner may then do a follow-on production OT. In the CSO guidance, right, the overarching document under which we were competing all of these individual contracts, that said, successful prototype projects may go into production, just like the statute says. But because we didn't then like double click it, reincorporate it into the individual solicitation, the GAO felt confident that we had like broken some sort of rule that didn't exist. And so like there's these ticky-tacky things along the way. But the unfortunate reality is that protest really cooled a lot of the enthusiasm for doing it in the first place, right? We are already a very risk-averse institution in defense acquisition. And when you allow something that ticky-tacky to have that sort of an impact, I mean, it was really challenging for us to move and get through at that time. And there were some other consequences. But what I would say is like the unfortunate reality is that company Raincloud, which had then raised a bunch of capital to sort of meet the demand that was about to come their way based on this really successful prototype project. I mean, this had a huge cascading effect on them where they eventually just sold to another private equity firm, and that technology sort of went away. And then, of course, from an operational standpoint, Transcom was unable to sort of like recompete it in a way that their command felt comfortable with, because obviously they weren't going to come back to us at that point, and we didn't really have the energy to like redo it again. So these things have like real consequences. So let's fast forward
Actually,
now to the
no,
secretaries.
let me
Oh,
pick at this one actually, because this is interesting,
yeah.
because this will explain some inherent government behavior that people who have never been in won't understand. So you took a big swing. Myself, my office, we had a couple of similar things where, we're doing things that are pushing the envelope. You have a lawyer somewhere that reviewed everything that you're going to do, that signed off on it. That's kind of putting the reputation on the line for doing something big. You get to the protest stage. Obviously, you believe you acted right. You're defending your behavior. You're writing it all up. It's twice the amount of work because you got to re-justify something you've already justified.
It ruined my summer. I
Yeah.
will just say that. Like, yes.
And if you push to the end, somebody will always ask, can we do corrective action? Can we just fix it? Can we like not get a final answer? But you want an answer. I want a decision. I want clarity in law. And you take a loss. You get a sustained protest. The behavior above you, like the command, the client, the willingness to go back and try again, that saps all of the energy out of like the innovation side, that we're going to take risks. And so that is inherently why the government takes less risks. Like if you do get to the end and take the loss, it killed the idea of production OTs for a couple of years, or the willingness to even try.
Correct. Yeah. And we had this grand vision, right? This is around the time we had started working together before this, and we had wanted to create this production OT marketplace, right? That was a project we were doing. It never saw the light of day. And gosh, I imagine the stuff that the secretary's memo would be highlighting would have like this natural outlet to sort of like see a ton of this innovation be getting done very quickly. And then what I will do, maybe just like because you went there about senior leadership, I wrote letters to what was then like the Office of the Secretary for Acquisition Sustainment and General Counsel, and asked them to give us a memo that would say, we see your protest, we see your sustained protest, execute on against this production contract anyways. because a sustained protest it's just a suggestion. We as the executive branch, the agency, have to decide whether or not we're going to terminate that contract or just like let it lie fallow or continue to use it because we feel good about what got us to that point in the first place. And from ANS, I received crickets. And from general counsel, I received an email that said, I could opine on this, but you may not like the answer that I will give you. So better for us to just operate in the ambiguity of nothing. And so you talk about a void of leadership because maybe they don't understand the implications that this is setting. But maybe that's like the perfect launching point into why the Secretary of War's recent memo is so incredible. Because Congress over the last several years has been urging and pushing the department to use these authorities to be better, to leverage commercial. Hell, this isn't a new concept. When was the Federal Acquisition Streamlined Act? It was like 1994 when we said we had a preference for commercial. And then the amount of lawsuits levied by the SpaceXs and the Palantirs of the world, sort of citing that the department is not using FASA in the way that it's supposed to, right? It's not having a preference for commercial first. But with Secretary of War Hegseth's memo, aligned with what we saw in the Forge Act that came out last December, within the SPEED Act that seems to be what the National Defense Authorization Act will sort of like turn into, is massive alignment across multiple parts of our government saying we have to do it this way. And what also the Secretary's memo identified is we are going to reorganize from a structural standpoint, and we're going to provide a level of carrots and sticks through a portfolio framework. And, pushing that speed of delivery is actually the thing that we should index against versus cost or performance, which are generally, the sacred two variables that you don't have any wiggle with, right? It's always schedule that gets delayed. And for now, like right now, we're saying schedule is of the utmost importance, and we're going to hold it above the others. And in fact, we're going to incentivize speed of delivery, which is exactly what we were doing at Defense Innovation Unit all those years ago, which was let's get these prototype projects into the hand of the operators and let's transition as quickly as possible and not live in the world of, indefinite prototyping.
Connected to the revolutionary FAR overhaul, they changed a bunch of the underlying acquisition regulations, but they didn't meaningfully change anything in Part 33 around protests. They didn't a lot of that stuff's statutory, so they
Right.
couldn't do it.
Right.
But one thing that would be beneficial. So you said you had a reluctance from your leadership at the time to do an override. Similarly, I've had that out of my political leadership. Asking the GSA administrator to override a GAO decision is asking a lot. It's asking for a political fight, on behalf of another agency. So maybe the next step would be to do something that encourages the agency to move forward based on speed versus focusing on we'll go do some more paper. Well, we'll do corrective action. We'll fix things. Cause the easy button is time. That will always just, all right, we'll do it again because you didn't like it, some detail.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely how it goes. And I think a lot of times leaders make what seem like rational decisions without fully understanding the second and third order effects that it will have on the acquisition community. But if you take that in the inverse, if you did have a leader that stood up and said, you know what, this time is different. This time I am going to protect the execution and the pushing of speed, that'll send a very clear message to the rest of the acquisition community that is what is important and what we're no longer willing to sacrifice. But it's going to take a lot of different levels of leadership, and it's going to take these types of documents being out there in the ether for the acquisition professional to point to and say, this is why I acted in accordance with whatever. And by law, I didn't break any laws. I followed all the regulations. It's just like maybe some weird policy or some weird guidance or cultural inertia that made people feel like this was not okay. And a lot of times we hamstring ourselves to that perception, and we gotta move through it.
All right, so a little segue now. You've graduated from the inside, where you're complying with all of the little arcane regulations and laws. When did you jump out, and what surprised you immediately upon joining the private sector?
Yeah, thanks. So I officially separated in the fall of 2021. So that was about the 13 and a half year mark for me being on active duty, which I will say is generally a bit later than people would flirt with getting out, right? At that point, you're so close to 20, you just got to do it, right? But for me, it was this incredible opportunity to join a team in Shield Capital that I had familiarity with, right? I had worked for Raj Shah at Shield or at Defense Innovation Unit, and what the mission that we were trying to do, which was support these early stage startups and understanding how the national security environment could be accretive to their value on their way to becoming, billion-dollar businesses. That to me was very attractive. And so when an opportunity like that hits you, you don't say no. And I have not regretted it at all. And I'm still fortunate enough where I can do about 4 to 5 weeks a year in uniform in a reserve capacity at the Pentagon and still stay connected in that standpoint because service is still very important. But I would say what has surprised me the most being out of uniform is the availability of conversations with professional staff members and members of Congress and very senior leaders within the departments, how easy it is to like get access and talk to them
That is
and
very
share with them.
surprising. As a lifelong career, I have zero interaction at that level.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's all very like sacred, hierarchical. In fact, it's almost, they don't want you to communicate when you're in uniform for fear that you're going to say the wrong thing and set your service or organization back a decade. And the reality is they want to hear about the interesting anecdotes, right? Versus like the anodyne information that they generally get from like the organization when you like aggregate everything in totality. Like it just doesn't tell them enough to be able to do something that would then support people like us at like the execution level. And they're so interested and willing to help. I mean, I think that has what has been so refreshing to me being on the outside now is being able to share these stories and have them like act in like meaningful, tangible ways. And maybe just like to not leave it in the abstract level. I've been very involved in this most recent SBIR sitter reauthorization, which right now that authority has lapsed. Maybe by the time this podcast comes out, something will have been done about it. But I got to engage with the Senate Small Business Committee around, what could a reauthorization look like that would actually help American startups and the national security apparatus do better. Because we just know we are losing our technological edge. And the SBIR sitter program, while small in like size, is very meaningful in signal to support entrepreneurs getting access to the national security apparatus. And so sort of the fight that we have been taking is this need to kill off these SBIR mills, right, that just sort of suffocate the system and do perpetual R&D as a lifestyle business without ever the intent of commercializing. And when you look at their arguments as for why they need to exist, it is so easy to pick apart their straw man arguments like one by one and just basically say, there's a replacement for that in the marketplace today. Like you don't need to exist. Your entire modus operandi for living is because you're good at proposal development and you've established relationships with govies in the labs, but what you are not doing is actually supporting the warfighter or the taxpayer. And so Senator Ernst, right, through her leadership, has tried to promote this thing called the INNOVATE Act, which would make it much easier for first-time SBIR recipients to get a foot in the door. It would focus on leveraging and maximizing third-party capital that are accelerating these startups, and it would put benchmarks around commercialization. And then, of course, it would also cap the amount of money that you as a company ought to be winning under these government grant programs. Because, why should you be able to have grant money in perpetuity? It's sort of like saying, you once upon a time got a welfare check, so for the rest of your life, you should always get a welfare check, and we should never try to help you get out of the need of welfare. It's just it's asinine, honestly. But I guess being on the outside and being able to highlight all of these stories and how these companies are providing really meaningful capabilities, especially these venture-backed ones, and why the SBIR program is so important for them getting sort of a head start into the system. I mean, they've been very receptive to it. So yeah, it's been really cool.
All right, so let me turn the direction then towards on the shield capital on the VC side, your interaction with the companies. Are you a government translator for them? Or this is what this means? This is are you explaining, or are you talking about the capability gaps that they need to be focused on that are particular to, the Department of War?
So I would say the capability gaps helps shape the investment thesis for the types of companies that we would be interested in investing in. Because while we would love for the department to evolve the way it thinks about what it needs, which it is doing, right? We just got rid of the JSIDS process, and something new will come in its place. So this idea of crystal ball foresight of system acquisition, and if the department didn't dream it up, right, that technology would never exist, right? We are moving away from that paradigm into one that is trying to be more opportunistic and flexible with the state of the art and what technology is just happening to be built specifically, outside with these commercial companies. But, realistically speaking, what I spend a lot of my time doing for the companies that we do invest in is, yes, helping them understand the government marketplace, making sure that they are bringing on the right partners and teammates and W-2 employees that have the ability to scale their business inside the national security. In certain cases, investments that we make, we'll tell them, don't start with the DoD or DOW, right? Actually, go just focus on the commercial side for now. And when you're a little bit better established, you have a little bit more flexibility, we can hire the right team, then we'll go, attack the national security marketplace and have it be an accretive part of your business. But yeah, you do spend a decent amount of time of that. It's been a lot of fun. But I'll say, as a venture capitalist, the most important thing that I do on a day in and day out basis is trying to find those best entrepreneurs worth investing in, who are just going to be able to figure it out and build compelling product that's going to bring incredible user satisfaction. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit of everything.
Okay, that's very cool. I just have one more question for you before we wrap up the podcast, and that is, every once in a while, I see you posting pictures on LinkedIn of people doing push-ups, usually with some, American background, like you're in front of the Washington Monument or something. What's the deal with the workouts that you're organizing, you're leading, or participating in?
Yeah, so you're talking about sweat equity. Oh
Yeah.
man. I'll try to make this brief, but essentially a couple years ago, a bunch of us Air Force guys who were separating decided, with our new flexibility of working from home, that on Thursday mornings we would meet up on the mall, do a workout, and drink some cold brew and socialize. And then over time, I sort of, I don't know, created a system around it and branded it Sweat Equity. So yes, between the middle of May to roughly the middle of September, when the weather is good and the sun is shining, at 0630, Sweat Equity will convene and do some sort of a workout that will involve some running, some calisthenics, some balancing, just a very variety of stuff. And really at its core is to provide a different type of networking opportunity that doesn't involve standing around at a beer garden or a bar and drinking. And it's been really great. So, now over the last 2 years since calling it Sweat Equity, we averaged a little over 10 people per session. And then this past year, we averaged over 20 people per session with a high watermark of 34. And yeah, we're at the National Mall, we're at the Carolyn Bells, we're at Haynes Point, we're at the Georgetown Waterfront Park. We try to just spice it up and have fun.
Very cool. Well, with that, I hope you see your numbers in Sweat Equity rise after this, and maybe someday if I make it up to DC, I'll try not to injure myself and join you.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to hosting you then, Chris, and thanks for having me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks a lot. This has been David and Chris from the Optimized Podcast, sponsored by VisibleThread. See you guys later.